The setting sun cast a warm amber glow over the modest suburban home, filling the room with a soft, golden light that seemed to ease the weight of time. In his favorite armchair sat 92-year-old Jan, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap, the years of his life evident in the deep lines that traced his face. His eyes, tired yet sharp, reflected a lifetime of experiences, of triumphs and sorrows, of moments lived and lost. The room was still, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, until the sound of the front door creaked open, drawing John's attention. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he shifted his gaze, his son Michael's familiar footsteps approaching. "Dad, I'm here," Michael called out, shrugging off his coat as he made his way into the living room. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of his father. John's expression had become more solemn in recent days, and Michael could sense something was different today, something heavy in the air. He watched his father carefully as he moved toward him, concern furrowing his brow. "I'm glad you came, son," John said, his voice carrying an unusual gravity making Michael pause. The tone immediately caught his attention, stirring something inside him, a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Michael settled into the chair opposite his father, his gaze never leaving John's face. "Is everything all right, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice filled with concern. There was something in his father's demeanor that seemed more distant, more burdened than usual. John let out a deep sigh, his eyes drifting downward to the worn rug beneath his feet, as if searching for words that had been buried for too long. "There's something I need to talk to you about, Michael," John began, his voice quiet but filled with a weight that made Michael sit up straighter, his attention fully on his father. "Something that's been weighing on my mind for a very long time." Michael leaned forward, instinctively wanting to be closer, to absorb every word his father had to say. John had always been a man of few words, a private man who kept much of his past to himself, especially when it came to the time he spent in the war. As long as Michael could remember, John had never been one to openly discuss his experiences on the battlefield. But there were moments, rare and precious moments, when John felt compelled to open up, to reveal pieces of the past he had buried deep within. "You know, I don't talk about my time in the war much," John said, his voice almost a whisper. "But there are some things that have been haunting me, memories I've carried with me for decades." His eyes darkened slightly and Michael felt a chill pass over him. The gravity of the conversation had deepened in a way he had not expected. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving his father's face, encouraging him to continue. He had heard bits and pieces of John's wartime experiences over the years, but his father had always been reluctant to delve deeper into the details. Now, for the first time, John was speaking openly, and Michael knew it was important to listen. "I've never told you about my friend Thomas," John continued, his voice trembling with the weight of unspoken emotions. "We served together back in the day. We were as close as brothers. We went through hell and back side by side, surviving battles that no man should ever have to endure." Michael's heart sank as he listened, understanding the weight of his father's words. He had always known John had seen unimaginable horrors, but hearing him speak about it, about someone he had shared those experiences with, made everything more real. John wasn't just talking about war in abstract terms, he was speaking about someone he had loved like family. "Thomas and I, we made a promise to each other," John continued, his voice softening as his eyes finally met Michael's. There was a vulnerability in John's gaze that Michael had never seen before. "A promise that I've been trying to keep for all these years. But now, I'm running out of time." A chill ran down Michael's spine as he processed his father's words. This was more than just a story, it was a call to action, a heavy responsibility that John was carrying alone. "What kind of promise, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he feared breaking the fragile silence that had settled between them. John took a deep, steadying breath, the weight of his next words evident in the way he paused before speaking. "Thomas and I, we swore that if one of us didn't make it back, the other would return to a certain place. A remote location, a place where we had shared a moment of solace during the war. We promised to honor the memory of those we lost, to make sure their sacrifice would never be forgotten." Michael's chest tightened as the words sank in. He had always known that his father's experiences in the war had shaped him, but to hear him speak so openly about the promise he had made to Thomas, to his friend, was something entirely different. The burden John had carried for so many years was now laid bare, and Michael could see the deep pain in his father's eyes as he spoke of a man he had lost long ago. "I'm getting old, Michael," John said, his voice trembling slightly, "and I'm running out of time to fulfill that promise. That's why I need your help. I need you to go with me." To see this through so that I can finally find the peace that's eluded me all these years? Michael felt a surge of emotions, confusion, concern, and a deep admiration for his father's unyielding sense of duty. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. It would be long, emotional, and filled with challenges that neither of them could foresee. But the resolve in John's eyes, the deep need to fulfill the promise he had made so many years ago, was something that Michael couldn't ignore. This was something his father had to do, and he would be there to help him no matter the cost. "Of course, Dad," Michael said, his voice filled with determination. He reached across the space between them and gently squeezed John's hand. "I'm here for you. Whatever you need." John's eyes glistened with ancient tears, and for a moment, Michael saw a glimpse of the young, vibrant man his father had once been. The weight of a lifetime seemed to lift from John's shoulders as he nodded gratefully, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you, son," John whispered, his voice filled with a profound sense of relief. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." In the silence that followed, the two men sat together, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow over the room. A quiet peace settled between them, as they prepared for a journey that would test the boundaries of their relationship and uncover the profound legacy of a promise made long ago. The following week, Michael arrived at his father's house, his heart heavy with anticipation. The previous visit had been an emotional one, and he knew that the journey ahead would be just as significant. As he stepped through the door, he found John sitting in his usual chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. John's expression was a mixture of apprehension and determination, a testament to the weight of the promise he had carried for so long. "Dad, I'm here," Michael said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. He moved to take a seat opposite his father, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet grounding him in the present moment. John looked up, a faint smile on his wrinkled face. "I'm glad you came, son," he replied, his tone a mix of relief and unease. "There's something more I need to tell you about this trip we're going to take." Michael nodded, sensing that there was more his father hadn't yet shared. He had known for some time that John had been holding something back, a piece of the past he hadn't yet revealed. And now, as they prepared to embark on this journey together, Michael knew that the answers would come, and with them, a deeper understanding of his father's past and the man he had become. The room was still, the amber light from the setting sun spilling across the old, worn furniture, casting long shadows across the walls of the modest suburban home. Jan, 92 years old, sat quietly in his favorite armchair, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap. The years had etched themselves into his face, deep lines carving paths from his eyes, tracing a lifetime of both joy and sorrow. As he sat there, gazing at the flickering light, his mind wandered through the long corridors of time, back to moments both cherished and painful. The creak of the front door broke the silence, and Jan's gaze shifted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His son Michael had arrived for their weekly visit, a ritual they had maintained for years. "Dad, I'm here," Michael called out from the doorway, shrugging off his coat. His voice had a familiar warmth, but today there was an edge to it, a sense of anticipation. He had noticed the change in his father over the past few weeks, the way John had grown more distant, more solemn. Michael stepped into the living room, taking a moment to observe his father. Jan's face had grown even more haggard with age, but his eyes, though tired, still held the wisdom of a lifetime. "I'm glad you came, son," John said, his voice carrying a weight that immediately caught Michael's attention. There was a gravity in his father's words today, something unspoken, something that suggested more than the casual conversations they had grown accustomed to. Michael moved closer, sitting in the chair opposite John, his concern deepening. "Is everything all right, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice soft and filled with concern. The moment John spoke those words, Michael knew something was different. His father had always been a man of few words, but this was different, a tone laced with heaviness, something more than the usual. "Just checking in?" John let out a deep sigh, his eyes moving from Michael to the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece, each image a reminder of a life lived. His fingers, knotted with age, flexed slightly as if searching for the right words. His gaze grew distant, lost in memories as he began to speak. "You know, the war was a terrible time," John started, his voice quiet but firm. "A time full of unspeakable horrors." He paused as though weighing the truth of his words. "But there were moments, brief flashes of humanity, that helped us keep going, moments that gave us the strength to carry on." His eyes focused on Michael's, the weight of what he was about to reveal settling between them. Michael leaned forward, his eyes locked on his father's face. He had heard snippets of his father's wartime experiences over the years, but today something about John's tone suggested that this was a story John had never shared, one that had remained locked away for decades. Thomas and I, John continued, his voice low and steady, we were in the thick of it, pinned down in a small village surrounded by the enemy. John's expression became pained as he spoke, his voice trembling slightly. It was chaos. Pure and utter chaos. Bullets flying, explosions shaking the ground beneath us. I can still hear the deafening sounds, feel the fear that gripped us. Michael could feel the chill run down his spine as his father spoke. The image of that chaos painted in John's words was so vivid, so raw, that Michael could hardly comprehend what it must have been like to endure such terror. John's gaze shifted, his focus now distant, as though the memories were pulling him back in time. In the midst of all that, we stumbled upon an old man huddled in the doorway of a crumbling building. John's voice softened, and for a moment, Michael could see the weariness in his father's eyes. He was terrified, his eyes wide with fear, but he welcomed us in. Offered us shelter. A moment of respite. Michael felt a deep sense of empathy stir within him as his father spoke of the old man. In a time when so much violence and hatred had surrounded them, this small act of kindness stood out like a beacon of light in a dark world. It was a reminder that even in the most trying of circumstances, humanity still existed. Michael could only imagine how that brief moment of compassion must have felt to his father, a stark contrast to the world they had been thrust into. That moment, John continued, his voice cracking with emotion, that small act of kindness, it changed everything for us. It reminded us that even in the darkest of times, there was still good in the world. Still a reason to fight. A reason to carry on. Michael's throat tightened as his father spoke. The weight of John's words, the emotional depth behind them, hit him harder than anything he could have imagined. This wasn't just a war story, this was a story of humanity, of the bond that formed between two strangers in the face of unimaginable chaos. Michael had always known that his father had witnessed horrors in the war, but to hear him speak so openly and vulnerably about it was both humbling and profound. That's where Thomas and I made our promise, John said, his gaze finally meeting Michael's. We swore that if one of us didn't make it back, the other would return to that village, to that old man's doorway. And we would honor the memory of all those we had lost. Michael's heart ached as he listened, understanding now the gravity of his father's words. He had heard stories before, but this was different. This was the moment that had shaped his father's life. The promise John had made to his friend, to Thomas, had haunted him for decades. It was a burden John had carried alone until now. I'm running out of time, son, John said, his voice barely a whisper. I need your help to see this through. To fulfill the promise I made all those years ago. The weight of those words settled heavily on Michael's chest, and he felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of love, fear, and the recognition of the immense responsibility that now lay before him. His father had carried this burden for so long, and now Michael would walk with him to fulfill it. Without hesitation, Michael reached across the space between them and grasped John's hand in a firm, reassuring grip. I'm with you, Dad, he said, his voice steady with determination. We'll do this together. No matter what it takes. John's eyes softened, a glimmer of hope flashing in them, and for a brief moment, Michael could see the young man his father once was. The soldier who had survived the war, the man who had made a promise to his friend. The weight of the world seemed to lift from John's shoulders as he nodded, a faint but grateful smile tugging at his lips. Thank you, Michael, John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You don't know how much this means to me. The following week, Michael arrived at his father's house, a sense of apprehension and anticipation hanging in the air. After their emotionally charged conversation, he knew that the journey they were about to embark on would be no ordinary one. It would test the limits of their relationship, push them both to confront the past, and uncover the depths of a promise made long ago. When Michael stepped through the door, he found John waiting for him, the same small leather-bound notebook clutched tightly in his father's weathered hands. John's expression was a mixture of determination and trepidation, the weight of years pressing down on him. Dad, I'm here, Michael said softly, his voice warm and reassuring as he made his way to the familiar armchair across from John. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, a comforting reminder of the countless conversations they had shared in this very room. John looked up, his eyes locking with Michael's with a newfound intensity. Thank you for coming, Michael, he said, his voice tinged with urgency. There's something else I need to tell you. Something I've been keeping to myself for far too long. Michael nodded, his full attention focused on his father, sensing the gravity of the situation. He knew that something profound was about to be revealed. This notebook, John said, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "It's the key to the promise I made to Thomas all those years ago." He paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. "Inside these pages, I documented everything. The details of our mission, the coordinates of the village where we found that old man, and the promise we made to honor his memory." John's voice wavered as emotion overtook him, and Michael could see the deep pain, the raw vulnerability in his father's eyes. "What are you saying, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his concern growing. "I'm saying that the time has come for me to fulfill that promise," John replied, his eyes locking with Michael's. "But I can't do it alone, Michael. I need your help. Your support to see this through." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the enormity of the journey ahead. This was not just a trip. This was the culmination of a lifetime of promises, a deep and sacred bond between father and son, and a final act of love and remembrance. He felt the chill of the unknown, but he also felt a fierce determination. Whatever it took, they would do it together. Michael sat in the armchair opposite his father, his heart swelling with a sense of duty and deep, unspoken love. His father, John, had lived a life filled with the weight of war, the ghosts of his past never far behind him. Yet in that moment, as he glanced at his father's worn hands and weary eyes, Michael understood the significance of the journey ahead. This wasn't just a trip to fulfill a promise made decades ago, it was the fulfillment of a burden John had carried alone for so long. Michael had always known his father had experienced horrors in the war, but to see him speak about them so openly now, after all these years, was a revelation. He had heard bits and pieces, fragments of the story, but nothing like this. The full, unvarnished truth of a young soldier's vow to a stranger, and the profound weight of that promise. "Of course, Dad," Michael said, his voice steady, but the gravity of the task ahead making his words feel almost too small. "I'm here for you every step of the way. Whatever it takes, we'll do this together." John's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Michael caught a glimpse of the young man his father had once been, the soldier with bright eyes and a fierce sense of honor. The weight of a lifetime seemed to lift from John's shoulders, as if the promise he had carried for so long was finally being shared. He nodded gratefully, his lips curving into a faint smile, the first Michael had seen in days. "Thank you, son," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I would have made it this far without you." The two men sat in silence, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hanging heavily between them. Michael knew that the journey ahead would be arduous, both physically and emotionally. They were not just retracing the steps of a soldier. This was about something deeper, a promise to honor a life, to fulfill a vow made in the face of terror. Michael had no illusions about what was to come, but he was determined. He would stand by his father no matter what. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the room, John reached out and placed the leather-bound notebook in Michael's hands. It was old, its edges frayed and the cover softened from years of handling. "This is where it all begins," John said, his voice filled with a sense of finality. Michael nodded, his fingers tracing the intricate stitching of the cover. He could feel the history of the notebook in his hands, the weight of all the untold stories and secrets hidden within its pages. John had told him that it contained the details of their mission during the war, the coordinates of the village, the description of the old man who had sheltered them, but Michael knew it was more than just a record of events. The notebook held the heart of John's promise, a promise that had never been forgotten, but one that had never been fulfilled until now. Taking a deep breath, Michael opened the first page, ready to embark on the journey that would test the limits of his resolve and uncover the profound legacy of a vow made long ago. The following morning, Michael arrived at his father's house with the notebook securely tucked in his bag. He had slept little the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. As he stepped through the door, he found John waiting for him in the same chair where he had always sat, the one that seemed to have become a part of him over the years. But today John's face was etched with a mixture of determination and trepidation, as if he too felt the gravity of the moment. "Are you ready, son?" John asked, his voice steady yet tinged with uncertainty. Michael looked into his father's eyes, finding them full of emotion that he had never seen before. He knew that what they were about to do wasn't just about fulfilling a promise, it was about bringing closure to a part of their lives that had haunted them for decades. "I am Dad," Michael said, his voice resolute. "Let's do this." The two men made their way to John's old pickup truck, the engine rumbling to life as they pulled out of the driveway. The familiar sounds of the truck, the tires on the pavement, felt comforting, grounding. But beneath the normalcy of the drive, there was an undeniable tension. They were heading into unknown territory, both literally and emotionally. Michael glanced at his father, watching the way John's brow furrowed as they drove. He had seen this look before, when John was deep in thought, focused on something that only he could understand. "We're getting close," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The coordinates in the notebook are just up ahead." Michael nodded, his heart pounding. The quiet, rolling countryside gave way to a more rugged, untamed terrain as they neared their destination. He knew they were entering a part of the world John had once known, but it had been decades since he had last set foot here. As they neared the small, unassuming village, Michael could feel the tension building. The landscape was familiar, but something felt off. The village seemed quieter than he had expected, as if the world had forgotten it. As they entered the narrow streets, Michael noticed the suspicious glances of the locals. They peered at the truck as it passed, their expressions wary and curious. Michael couldn't help but feel a creeping unease settle in his stomach. "What's going on, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice laced with concern. "Why are they looking at us like that?" John let out a heavy sigh, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a palpable sense of discomfort. "This place, it's changed a lot since I was last here. Back then it was a quiet, peaceful village. But it seems the world has caught up to it." Michael followed his father's gaze, taking in the weathered buildings, the once charming houses now standing in various states of disrepair. The people moved with a sense of wariness, and the tension in the air was palpable. It was as though the village, once a refuge, had become a place where memories lingered, both good and bad, and the ghosts of the past weren't welcome. "We need to find the old man's house," John said, his voice low and urgent. "If we can just speak to him, explain why we're here, maybe he can help us." Michael nodded, but his mind was racing. He had expected difficulty, but not this. The village felt off. They were being watched, scrutinized. As they drove deeper into the heart of the town, they carefully scanned the buildings, looking for any sign of the house that had once provided shelter and solace in the midst of chaos. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley. He was an older man, his face lined with age, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. "What business do you have here, strangers?" he called out, his voice carrying an edge of distrust. John's eyes widened, but he quickly stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Sir, we mean you no harm," John said, his voice calm and steady. "We're looking for the old man who once lived here. The one who offered us shelter during the war." The stranger's expression darkened and he shook his head, his lips pressed tightly together in disapproval. "The old man you speak of? He's long gone. Passed on many years ago." Michael felt his heart sink. The weight of his father's disappointment was palpable, and he could see the fire in John's eyes dimming, his shoulders slumping with the crushing realization that they had arrived too late. The promise that had driven them here, the hope that had sustained them, now seemed like a distant dream. "Then we've come too late," John murmured, his voice filled with profound regret. The stranger eyed them warily, his arms crossed over his chest, but his expression softened ever so slightly. "What is it you're looking for exactly?" he asked, his tone now tinged with curiosity. John took a deep breath, steadying himself. He met the stranger's gaze, his resolve firming. "My friend and I, we made a promise to that old man," John said, his voice gaining strength. "A promise to honor the memory of those we lost during the war. We've come to fulfill that promise, to bring closure to a chapter of our lives that's haunted us for decades." The stranger's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. He stood silently for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought before finally speaking. "The old man's house, it's still here," he said, his voice softer now. "The family that lives there now, they're not fond of outsiders. If you're set on this, you'll need to tread carefully." John nodded, his eyes lighting up with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, sir. We'll do our best to make this right." As they made their way toward the old man's house, Michael felt a sense of dread creeping up his spine. The obstacles they faced were mounting, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were too late, if the promise was something that could never be fully fulfilled. But one thing was clear, they had come this far and they would see it through no matter the cost. The journey had been long and fraught with uncertainty, but Michael's determination to support his father remained unwavering. The promise that John had carried for so many years, the weight of it, was now something Michael would help him bear. As they approached the old man's house, Michael felt the burden of the mission grow heavier with each passing step. The streets were unusually quiet, the locals watching them with eyes full of suspicion and curiosity, as if they were unwelcome intruders in a place that had long since moved on from the past. John's steps were slow and deliberate, the sound of his boots on the cracked pavement steady and echoing in the stillness. His eyes, scanning the crumbling buildings around them, seemed to search for something that no longer existed. Familiarity. Oh. The houses had changed since his last visit, and the faces of the people, too, seemed to be part of a world that had left him behind. Michael stayed close to his father's side, walking in silence. His own heart raced, the unease mounting inside him as they neared their destination. Finally they stood before the house. It was modest, weathered, its once vibrant facade now faded and worn by time and neglect. Michael could feel his father's hesitation, the years of history in that place pressing down on him, and in that moment, John seemed smaller somehow, like a man standing at the edge of a memory, afraid to step too far into it. John paused, his hand resting gently on the door. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the weathered wood, and Michael saw the years of pain, hope, and regret etched across his father's face. John had spoken of this house many times over the years, of the promises made, of the friend who had once offered refuge during the chaos of war. But standing here now, in front of the place where everything had begun and ended, the weight of it all seemed almost unbearable. "This is it," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is the place." Michael nodded silently, his gaze fixed on his father. He saw how the resolve in John's face seemed to waver, how the burden of the promise threatened to swallow him whole. The promise John had carried for decades, the promise to honor a friend, to bring closure to a chapter of his life that had been left open for far too long, now hung in the air between them like a fragile thread. John took a deep breath, gathering his strength, and reached out to knock on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet street, reverberating in the stillness like a call to something lost. They stood there, waiting, the seconds stretching out into what felt like an eternity. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a middle-aged woman standing on the other side. She eyed them with suspicion, her brow furrowed in a mixture of wariness and guarded curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious, as if unsure whether to trust these strangers standing on her doorstep. John stepped forward, his expression softening, though the lines of age and worry still marked his features. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to intrude," John began, his voice calm but tinged with a quiet urgency. "But I'm looking for the old man who used to live here. I'm an old friend and I've come a long way to see him." The woman's eyes narrowed and she shook her head, her lips pressing into a tight, disapproving line. "I'm afraid the old man you're looking for is no longer with us," she said, her voice laced with finality. "He passed away several years ago." The words hit John like a physical blow, and Michael could see the weight of disappointment settle onto his father's shoulders. His father had hoped, so deeply hoped, that they would find the man who had once given them shelter, someone who had been a part of his life during the war, a person who had shared in the hardships and sacrifices. But now that hope had been extinguished. The weight of the promise, the last thread of connection to that part of John's past, seemed to slip through his fingers. "I see," John murmured, his voice tinged with a profound sense of sorrow. His gaze fell to the ground, his shoulders slumping. He trailed off, the words unspoken, but the weight of them was heavy. He had hoped for a different outcome, for a reunion that might finally bring him the closure he had longed for. The woman studied him for a moment, her expression softening ever so slightly. She looked down the street as if considering whether or not to share what she knew. After a brief hesitation, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I'm sorry," she said. "But the old man's house, it's been in my family for generations. We don't take kindly to strangers poking around, even if they claim to be old friends." John nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the worn, weathered steps leading up to the doorway. The steps that had once welcomed him, now stood as silent witnesses to a past that was slowly fading. The woman's words stung, but he understood. The house, the memories, the past, it was all changing just as he had changed. "I understand," John said, his voice laced with resignation. "We've come a long way, but it seems we're too late." Michael's heart was heavy with the weight of their disappointment. His father's quest for closure had seemed so close, and now, it felt as though it had slipped out of reach. He placed a gentle hand on John's shoulder, offering what comfort he could, but he knew that nothing could fill the void that had opened between them. "Dad, we can still try to find another way," Michael said quietly, his voice low and reassuring. "Maybe there's someone else who can help us." But John shook his head slowly, his eyes distant, filled with a profound sense of regret. "No, son," he said softly. "I'm afraid this is where our journey ends." As they turned to leave, their shoulders heavy with the weight of their failure, the woman hesitated, her expression shifting as though something had changed in her heart. She looked around the street quickly as if afraid someone might overhear, and then beckoned them closer. "Wait," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it's truly that important to you, maybe there's another way I can help." John and Michael turned back, their eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. The woman studied them for a moment, her gaze darting around the quiet street, as if ensuring they weren't being watched. Then after a brief pause she spoke again. "There's an old man," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "A neighbor of ours. He knew the previous owner well. He might be able to help you if you're willing to take the risk." John's eyes widened, a spark of hope lighting up in his chest. He nodded quickly, stepping forward, his hand reaching out to grasp the woman's in a gesture of gratitude. "We are, ma'am. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart." With renewed determination, John and Michael made their way down the narrow, winding streets, their eyes scanning the crumbling buildings for any sign of the neighbor the woman had mentioned. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker, the wary glances of the locals a constant reminder of the obstacles they faced. Finally they approached a modest, well-kept home. The house was different from the others they had passed, its paint still fresh, the garden tended to, a sense of care and attention evident in every detail. John paused in front of it, his gaze fixed on the weathered door. This, he thought, must be the place. His voice was low, a mixture of hope and trepidation in his words. "This must be it," he murmured. Michael nodded, his hand resting lightly on his father's shoulder, offering silent support. "Are you ready, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft but steady, trying to reassure his father despite the unease that hung in the air. John took a deep, steadying breath and stepped forward. His knuckles rapped gently against the wooden door, the sound loud in the otherwise quiet street. They stood there waiting. The seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, the silence pressing in on them until, at last, the door creaked open. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his eyes narrow with suspicion, his expression stern and unwelcoming. "What do you want?" the man growled, his voice gruff and cold. John straightened, his posture proud but respectful. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice earnest and steady. "Sir, we're looking for information about the old man who used to live in the house down the street," John explained. "The woman there said you might be able to help us." The elderly man studied them for a moment, his brow furrowing as he eyed them wearily, his gaze darting between father and son. The tension hung in the air, thick with uncertainty as Michael waited, his heart pounding in his chest, hoping for a way forward. The elderly man's voice, laced with hostility, cut through the heavy silence that had descended upon the room. "What business is it of yours?" he snapped, his tone bitter and unwelcoming. The words hit Michael like a cold gust of wind, stirring a knot of unease in his chest. His heart began to race, anxiety creeping up his spine as he watched his father's face shift. John's shoulders slumped, the weight of his years pressing down on him, the burden of a promise made long ago etched deeply in his features. Michael couldn't help but feel the shift in the air, the older man's posture betraying a vulnerability that was never fully revealed. This promise had haunted John for decades, and now it felt as though the years were bearing down on him with a crushing force. Every line on his father's face seemed to tell a story of struggle, of time slipping by, of words left unspoken. John had never been one to ask for help, but now, he stood at the precipice of something that was too important to let go. "Please, sir," John said, his voice soft and pleading, a stark contrast to the harshness that had come from the man's words. He took a step forward, his gaze steady but filled with desperation. "My friend and I, we made a promise to that old man, a promise we've been trying to keep for decades. We've come a long way and we're running out of time. If there's any way you could help us." The elderly man's expression softened just a fraction. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes lingered on John's face, searching as if weighing the sincerity of the older man's words. The silence between them seemed to stretch, but then with a deep sigh the man stepped aside. His hand gestured toward the interior of the home, his voice, though still gruff, lost some of its initial sharpness. "Come in then," the man muttered, his words reluctant but softened by the unspoken understanding that something more was at play than simple curiosity. "But make it quick. No sense in standing here all day." John and Michael exchanged a glance, a flicker of hope sparking in their eyes. It was brief, a momentary break in the weight that had been bearing down on them for so long. Without a word, they stepped across the threshold and into the modest home. The air inside was heavy with age, but the space was neat and well kept, the kind of place that spoke of decades of quiet living. The furnishings were simple, worn wood and humble chairs, yet there was a sense of care in the way everything was arranged, as if the owner had taken pride in preserving the past. John's eyes darted to the surroundings, the worn wooden tables and chairs, the faded photographs hanging on the walls, everything familiar yet strange. There was a haunting sense of déjà vu, as if the place held memories he had long since buried deep within himself. He had spent time in homes like this during his youth, when life had been less complicated, when friends had meant more than anything else in the world. The elderly man cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the reverie of memories that had overtaken John. "The old man you're looking for," the neighbor began, his eyes fixed on John and Michael. "His name was Ezra. He was a good man, always willing to lend a hand to those in need. A quiet sort but kind." John nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat. He could feel the weight of Ezra's memory pulling at him, stirring something deep within his chest. That name, Ezra, was more than just a person from the past, it was the key to the promise, the lifeline John had clung to all these years. Ezra had been a friend, a comrade during difficult times, and the promise John made to him before everything changed had become an anchor in his life. "That's him," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion barely audible. His eyes glistened, the burden of the years spent searching for Ezra now pressing into his very soul. "That's the man we're looking for. Can you tell us more about him? About what happened to him?" The elderly man's expression grew somber. He sighed heavily as if the memory of Ezra brought with it a sorrow that had never truly faded. His gaze softened as he spoke, but there was an underlying sadness in his words. "Ezra passed away a few years ago," he said quietly, his tone heavy with the weight of the loss. "God rest his soul. He never married, never had any family to speak of. But he was beloved by this entire community, even if he never wanted to be the center of attention. He kept to himself mostly, but if anyone needed him, he was there." John's shoulders sagged, his face a mask of sorrow and disbelief. The disappointment was palpable, and Michael could see it etched across his father's features. It was as though the last thread of hope had unraveled before him, and the distance between what John had longed for and the reality of their situation grew impossibly vast. "I'm sorry, son," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with grief. He reached out to grasp Michael's hand, the gesture one of both comfort and shared loss. "It seems we've come too late." But before the despair could settle fully in the room, the elderly man raised his hand, his expression shifting with a glimmer of understanding. He seemed to consider John's words more carefully, the sternness in his demeanor replaced with a flicker of something else. "Wait," the man said, his voice softer now as if reconsidering what he had said. "There's more. You said you made a promise to Ezra, didn't you?" John's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a sudden, fragile hope. Yes, that's right. We promised to return here to this very place, to honor the memory of those we lost during the war. John's voice faltered for a moment as the years of longing and unspoken words choked him. "We promised Ezra that we would never forget. That we would remember." The elderly man nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one tinged with bittersweet recognition, as if he understood something John couldn't articulate. "Well then," he said, his voice gruff but laced with understanding, "it seems you've come to the right place after all." Ezra, he kept a journal. A full journal of memories, stories from his life. He kept it hidden away from prying eyes, but I think he would have wanted you to have it. John's breath caught in his throat. The journal. The key to the promise, the tangible link to Ezra and to everything that had been left unsaid. The weight of it, the thought of holding something so precious, something that might finally help them honor their lost friends and the promises made in the dark of war, was almost too much to bear. As the elderly man disappeared into the next room, John and Michael exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had faced so many obstacles to get here, had endured the cold indifference of the world around them, but now the prospect of Ezra's journal, his memories, offered a flicker of light in the darkness. Moments passed, each one stretching longer than the last, as the sounds of the elderly man rummaging through his home echoed in the background. John shifted in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests, his knuckles white from the tension. He couldn't sit still, couldn't bear the uncertainty that lingered in the air. His mind raced, imagining what the journal might contain, what it might reveal about Ezra's final years, about the man who had been a friend during a time when friends had been everything. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the elderly man returned, his weathered hands clutching a small leather-bound book. The journal. Ezra's journal. He held it out to John and Michael, his expression unreadable but somehow softer, as if he understood the significance of this moment. "This was Ezra's," the man said quietly, his voice low and tinged with respect. He kept it hidden, kept it from prying eyes, but I think he would have wanted you to have it. John's hands trembled as he reached out to take the journal. The leather was worn, the edges frayed with age, but the book itself seemed to pulse with life, as if it carried the weight of everything Ezra had experienced. John's fingers brushed the surface, the sensation like touching a ghost from his past. "Thank you," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to us." The elderly man nodded, his eyes lingering on the father and son before him. His expression softened ever so slightly, though the lines of his face remained etched with years of hardship. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, his tone softening just a fraction. Michael, ever the steady presence by his father's side, placed a reassuring hand on John's shoulder. "We'll be careful with it, sir," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "Thank you." As the elderly neighbor ushered them toward the door, John paused, his eyes scanning the weathered facade of the home one last time. His mind was swirling with memories, with the weight of the promise, and with the hope that this journal, this final piece of Ezra, might be the key to unlocking everything that had been left behind. "Thank you," John said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to carry more than gratitude. They carried the weight of decades of waiting, of promises kept and broken, of a lifetime of longing. The elderly man nodded once, his expression unreadable, and with that, John and Michael stepped back out into the quiet street. The journal was clutched tightly in John's hands, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of the mission that lay ahead. They walked back to the truck in silence, each step heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. The world outside seemed unchanged, but within their hearts, something had shifted. They were no longer just two men on a journey, they were the bearers of a promise, one that would guide them toward something greater than they had ever imagined. John ran his fingers over the cover of the journal, his brow furrowing with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Are you ready, Dad?" Michael's voice broke the silence, low and reassuring. John took a deep, steadying breath, his gaze fixed on the journal in his hands. "Yes, son," he said, his voice resolute. "Let's see what's inside." As John and Michael sat together, poring over the weathered pages of Ezra's journal, the world outside seemed to fade into the background. The journal was old, its leather cover cracked and its pages yellowed with age, but its contents were as vivid and powerful as ever. Ezra's handwriting, a steady and beautiful script, unfolded the tapestry of a life well lived, one that was filled with resilience, compassion, and profound impact on the people around him. John could almost hear Ezra's voice as he read, each word bringing the man to life in ways that neither of them had expected. There were stories of kindness, moments of quiet heroism during the darkest days of the war, and the unwavering loyalty Ezra had shown to his friends and comrades. His resilience shone through in the pages, recounting the hardship he had endured without complaint, his determination to keep going even when the world seemed intent on breaking him. The words in the journal weren't just a reflection of the man Ezra had been, they were a testament to the strength of character that had shaped the lives of everyone who had known him. The more they read, the more John's heart swelled with admiration for the man they had come to honor. Ezra had been a man who believed in the importance of promises, in keeping one's word, even when the cost was great. But then, as they turned to the last few pages of the journal, something unexpected appeared. Buried among the memories of the past, tucked carefully between the lines, was a map, a set of coordinates that led to a location far from the village they had just visited. John's hands trembled as he traced the lines of the map with his weathered fingers, the ink faded but still legible. His eyes widened, a mixture of awe and disbelief crossing his face. "This must be it," Michael said, his voice low but filled with an excitement that John could hear clearly. There was a note of trepidation in his tone too, an undercurrent of uncertainty that mirrored John's own feelings. "The place where you and Thomas made your promise. The place we need to go." John nodded, his mind racing as the realization hit him. This was it. This was where everything had started, where the promises had been made, where the echoes of the past had lingered for so long. His fingers traced the faded lines on the map again, each movement carrying him deeper into the memories of his youth. He had spent years trying to keep that promise, trying to honor the memory of his old friend Thomas and the sacrifices they had made together. Now, it seemed that the time had come to fulfill it, to finally bring closure to the promises made in the darkest days of the war. "Yes, son," John's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion there too. His gaze never left the map as he spoke, his mind working through the years of longing and regret that had built up in him. "This is where it all began. This is where we need to go." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Michael could see the weight of them pressing down on his father, but there was also a fire in John's eyes, one that hadn't been there before. The promise to Ezra, to Thomas, had become a beacon for John, a guiding light that had steered him through the darkness for decades. And now the time had come to fulfill it. As they climbed into the truck and began their journey, the landscape around them shifted. The familiar suburban streets gave way to winding rural roads, and the terrain gradually grew more untamed, less hospitable. The transformation was subtle at first, but it soon became clear that they were venturing into unfamiliar territory, land that was wild, untouched by the hand of man for decades. The further they drove, the more isolated the world seemed to become, the more the weight of their mission pressed in on them. The map, Ezra's journal, had led them to a remote, secluded location, a place far from the village and the life they had known. The air felt different now, charged with an unease that Michael couldn't shake. It was as if they were drawing closer to something, a place that had been hidden away for a reason. Michael glanced at his father, studying his weathered face. There was a deep resolve in John's eyes, a determination that had been absent for years. But there was also something else, trepidation. John's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white from the strain. Michael knew that his father was no stranger to the darkness of the world, but this was different. This wasn't just a mission, it was the culmination of a lifetime's worth of memories and promises. "Dad," Michael said softly, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Are you sure about this? We can turn back, you know. If it's too much." John hesitated, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The question hung in the air between them, but after a moment, John's voice broke the silence, steady and unwavering. "No, son," he said, his tone filled with a quiet strength. "We've come this far. I need to see this through. No matter what." Michael could hear the finality in his father's voice, and though his own heart was heavy with doubt, he nodded. John had made a promise to his friend, to Thomas, to the men they had lost during the war, and now it was time to fulfill it. Michael knew that this was something John had to do, something that would bring him the peace he had sought for so long. He couldn't turn back, not now. The road grew narrower as they turned off the main highway and onto a barely visible path. The landscape was becoming more rugged, more inhospitable, the trees closing in around them as if trying to block their way. The path ahead seemed to disappear into the dense undergrowth, and Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This was no longer the world he knew. They were venturing into territory that was unfamiliar, and it felt as though the land itself was pushing back against them. Just as the tension began to mount, a figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the shadows of the thick foliage. John's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively slowed the truck to a halt. Michael's hand reached for the door handle, his body tense, ready for whatever confrontation might come. The figure drew closer, its features becoming clearer in the dimming light, and Michael's breath caught in his throat when he recognized the man. It was the elderly neighbor, the one who had given them Ezra's journal. The man's face was a mixture of trepidation and understanding, his expression grave as he raised a weathered hand in a cautious greeting. "I thought you might be coming this way," the elderly man said, his voice low and tinged with caution. "The locals, they're not too fond of strangers poking around these parts." John nodded, his gaze scanning the area around them. His mind was undoubtedly racing, filled with memories of the past and the risks they were now facing. "We know the risks, sir," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "But we have to see this through. For Thomas and for Ezra." The elderly man studied them for a moment, his brow furrowed with concern. Then after a long pause he spoke, his voice resolute. "Then you'll need my help," he said. "The path ahead is treacherous and the locals, they won't take kindly to your presence." Michael felt a surge of relief wash over him, his eyes meeting the elderly man's with a silent expression of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they continued on, the elderly neighbor leading the way, Michael couldn't help but marvel at the transformation in his father. John, a man who had carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of memories and regrets, seemed to have shed the burden. His steps were quicker now, his back straighter, his resolve unshakable. The promise he had made all those years ago had become his guiding star, and Michael could see the change it had wrought in him. This journey was no longer just about fulfilling an old promise. It had become a path to redemption, to peace, to the closure John had longed for. In that moment, Michael knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would stand by his father, helping him fulfill the promise they had made to the men they had lost, honoring their memories and finding the peace that had long eluded them. He would do whatever it took to help John fulfill his mission, to honor the past, and to bring closure to a chapter that had remained open for far too long.